The cavalry patrol had already passed the wagon when the youngest private turned in his saddle and looked back. He could not stop looking. A boy stood by the front axle holding an ox bow in both hands, holding it the way a child holds something familiar when the thing it belongs to is gone. Two animals lay stiff in the frost beside the trail, ribs showing through hide that had gone white at the edges. Canvas snapped against a torn cover. An iron tire clicked loose against a cracked wheel, ticking like a clock no one had wound. The sergeant dismounted, cut the dead animals free, coiled the chain, and set it on the wagon gate. Then he said something the private would remember for years. "Ma'am, without a team, this wagon is not transportation. It is lumber." The oxen had been dead less than 6 hours when the flies found them. Marit Vangen stood 12 miles from Fort Dodge on the south side of the Arkansas River with a 9-year-old boy, a wagon she could not move, and $31 in coins sewn into the lining of her coat. The date was the 23rd of October, 1881. The brother-in-law who had promised to see her through to the Cimarron route had taken his horse and left before dawn, and the reason was lying in the wash beside the trail. Two gaunt longhorns with their ribs showing through hide that had gone stiff in the frost. Eli stood near the front axle, holding an ox bow in both hands. He did not cry. He had stopped crying somewhere in Missouri, after his father's fever broke the wrong way and the women in the boarding house wrapped the body in a quilt Marit had carried from Minnesota. Now the boy held the bow like he was waiting for someone to tell him where the animal was. The claim receipt was in her coat with the coins. 160 acres, filed under the Homestead Act in her own name because widows could do that, because the law said a woman alone could hold land if she lived on it and improved it. She had filed in Dodge City 8 days ago. The clerk had looked at her, looked at Eli, and stamped the paper without comment. The land was real. The river was real. The problem was everything between the paper and survival. She had 40 pounds of flour in a sack that had torn at one corner and been tied with harness cord, 12 pounds of beans, a quarter side of salt pork wrapped in canvas, one box stove with a cracked front leg, held together with a strip of iron she had bent herself in a freighter's camp 3 weeks ago, one shovel with a loose handle, one axe, a coil of rope, and half a cord of cottonwood scraps stacked behind the wagon box, pieces she had gathered from deadfall along the trail because her husband had taught her never to pass wood you could reach. Half a cord. She needed 6 to survive a plains winter. She knew this the way she knew her own name because every Norwegian child learned the arithmetic of cold before they learned to read. A stove that size would burn a quarter cord per week in hard weather. Winter on the plains ran 20 weeks if it came early and stayed, 6 cords minimum. She had a fraction of 1. The wagon itself was a prairie schooner, 14 feet long, 4 feet wide, 2 feet deep in the box. The canvas cover had torn along the north side, where a cottonwood branch had caught it in a crossing. One rear wheel had a cracked felloe and an iron tire that clicked loose with every turn. The tongue was split where the left ox had stumbled and twisted against the yoke chain. She could not pull it. She could not repair it on the trail. She could not sell it because there was no one to sell it to. And she could not leave it because everything she owned in the world was either inside it or lying dead beside it. The Fort Dodge patrol found her on the afternoon of the same day. There were 5 soldiers and a mail pouch moving south along the river road. Sergeant Abel Quince rode at the front. 46 years old, cavalry boots cracked at the ankle. A man who had wintered on the plains 9 times and buried people after 6 of those winters. He saw the wagon from 200 yards and knew the shape of trouble before he reached it. Quince dismounted and walked the scene the way a surgeon walks a ward. He touched the wagon tongue and felt the split. He pressed his thumb against the cracked wheel and watched the tire shift. He looked at the dead oxen, looked at the cut where Marit had already stripped the usable harness leather, and looked at the boy still holding the bow. A young private named Jonah Reeve hung back near the horses. He was 19 and had not yet seen a winter on the southern plains. He watched Eli and did not know where to look. Quince cut the dead oxen free from the remaining yoke chain with 3 strokes of his belt knife. He coiled the chain and set it on the wagon gate. Then he turned to Marit. "How long since the team went down?" "This morning," Marit said. "The second one was down before I woke." Quince looked at the half-cord of cottonwood. He looked at the stove visible through the torn canvas. He looked at the flour sack with its tied corner. "Ma'am," he said, "without a team, this wagon is not transportation. It is lumber." Marit said nothing. "You have no plow," Quince continued. "You have no finished shelter. You do not have enough fuel to heat a dog through November, let alone a winter. You have no man to cut timber, no team to haul stone, and the nearest reliable neighbor is more than 3 miles east." He paused. "A safe winter structure on these plains needs a roof that sheds snow, walls that do not weep, a stovepipe that draws clean, and at least 6 cords of seasoned wood within arm's reach. You have none of those things. Not one." Marit looked at the claim receipt she had pulled from her coat. The paper was soft from handling. Eli's name was not on it, but he was the reason it existed. "What does a person do," she asked, "when none of those things are possible?" Quince pulled his gloves tighter. Behind him, Private Reeve shifted in his saddle and stared at the river. "They go back," Quince said. "They sell out to someone with the means. Or they freeze. Those are the choices I have seen, and I have seen them all." He told her one more thing before he mounted. A man named Rulon Maddox had been buying failed claims along the Arkansas, 3 already this season, from widows and sick men who could not hold through winter. If Marit could not prove up her claim by spring, Maddox would come with a price. He said the price was usually $5. Quince touched his hat and rode south. The patrol disappeared into the grass and dust, and the sound of tack faded, and Marit stood beside 2 dead animals in a broken wagon with a child who had not spoken since the sergeant arrived. She did not cry. She did not sit down. She pulled the belt knife from her coat, cut the last usable strips of leather from the ox harness, saved the yoke pins in a canvas fold, measured the wagon bed with a length of cord, and walked to the riverbank. The bank rose 8 feet above the water line, undercut by spring floods into a hard clay lip that jutted out over dry ground. Grass roots laced through the top layer like stitching in a quilt. Below the lip, the clay was pale, dry, and dense. Marit put her hand against it. The surface was cool but not cold. The wind, which had been pulling at her hair and snapping the torn canvas since morning, stopped. She stood under the overhang and felt nothing move. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived the way most ideas arrive when survival depends on them, in pieces, dragged together by a mind that refuses to stop counting. Eli found the first piece. He was chasing a tin cup that had rolled off the wagon gate, and it tumbled down the bank and lodged under the clay overhang. He crawled in after it, and Marit heard the change before she saw it, the wind cutting off like a door had closed. She crawled in beside him. The space was narrow, perhaps 6 feet deep where the flood had carved it, and the ceiling was uneven, but 3 things were immediately true. The clay was dry. The grass roots held the top layer like a woven mat, and the sound of the wind, which had been a constant pressure against her ears for weeks, dropped to a murmur. She pressed her palm flat against the clay wall. Still air. No draft, no seepage, no vibration from the gust above. And then the memory opened. She was 7 years old, standing in a turf-roofed farmhouse in Hardanger, watching her mother Birgit press a handful of wet turf into a crack where wind was whistling through the wall. Birgit had laid her palm against one side of the repaired section and then taken young Marit's hand and placed it on the other side. "Feel," Birgit had said. "Winter does not kill with cold alone. Cold sits still. It waits. What kills is the wind that carries the cold through every crack, every gap, every place you forgot to seal. Still air you can heat. Moving air steals everything you burn." Marit had not thought about that lesson in 20 years. Now it was the only thing in her mind. She climbed out of the overhang and walked back to the wagon. The box sat on its broken wheels, 14 feet long, 4 feet wide, with cracked sideboards and a torn canvas top. The wheels were useless. The tongue was split. The canvas was shredding. But the box itself, the floor, the sideboards, the frame, was still a room. She measured it again with the cord. 12 feet of usable interior if she cut away the damaged front section, 4 feet wide. High enough for Eli to sit upright on a sleeping shelf, high enough for Marit to crouch beside the stove. If she could get the wagon box under the clay overhang, she would not need to build 4 walls. The bank would be the roof and the windward wall. She would need to bury the exposed side in clay and sod, leave a narrow opening facing away from the prevailing wind, cut a chimney hole through a thin section where the bank thinned near the edge, and dig a drainage trench below the threshold to keep meltwater from pooling inside. She scratched the plan in river mud with a broken stick. Eli watched from the bank. The design was not a dugout, because she could not excavate a full room from the bank without risking collapse, and she had no timber to frame a roof. It was not a sod house, because she lacked the weeks of labor and the volume of cut sod needed for 4 walls and a supported ceiling. It was something between a sadasnai, a hybrid that used the wagon box as the interior shell, the riverbank as the roof and windbreak, and packed clay and sod as insulation over the exposed side. The wagon would become the skeleton. The earth would become the skin. She did the math on her knees in the mud. The exposed west side of the wagon was roughly 12 feet by 3 feet, 36 square feet that needed to be covered. Prairie sod cut 12 inches wide and 4 inches thick would stack like bricks. She would need perhaps 60 strips, layered and staggered, backed by packed clay. She could cut that much in 3 days if the sod was good and the shovel held. The chimney was the risk. Stovepipe through earth and clay could crack from heat, and backdraft in a north wind could fill the shelter with smoke. Calvin Bledsoe would later teach her how to angle the pipe and collar it with clay, but she did not know that yet. What she knew was this: still air could be heated, moving air could not. And the riverbank offered the stillest air she had found since Norway. Hester Bell arrived the next morning carrying a pail of milk and a face full of worry. Hester was 38, the mother of 4 children and the nearest neighbor Eastie, 3.5 miles by the river road. She had heard about the dead oxen from a freighter who had passed the patrol. She had come expecting to find a woman ready to quit. Instead, she found Marit on her knees beside the wagon, cutting willow poles to length with the axe. "I brought milk for the boy," Hester said. She set the pail on the wagon gate and looked at the riverbank where Marit had already cleared brush from the base of the overhang. "What are you doing to that bank?" Marit explained. She spoke plainly, the way she spoke about everything, not to persuade, but to describe. The wagon box backed under the overhang, the clay and sod packed against the open side, the stove inside, the pipe through a thin section of bank, the drainage trench below. Hester listened with her arms crossed. She was not cruel. She had wintered in Kansas 3 times, and buried a stillborn child in frozen ground that took her husband 2 days to break with a pick. She knew what cold did to people who were not ready, and she knew what damp did to children who slept in earth. "The bank will cave," Hester said. "First hard rain and the whole lip comes down on that box. I've seen dugouts slump. The walls sweat, the roof sags, and children get the croup that turns to pneumonia." "The clay is dry under the lip," Marit said. "The roots hold the top layer. The overhang has stood through at least 2 spring floods without falling." "And the smoke?" Hester asked. "You put a stove in a hole with one opening and a clay ceiling, and the smoke has nowhere to go. You will choke before you freeze." "The pipe goes through the thin section at the edge, not through the main bank. I angle it up so the draft pulls east." "You have done this before?" "No." Hester looked at the wagon, then at the bank, then at Eli sitting on a stone eating a cold biscuit. "Why not build a soddy?" she asked. 14 by 16, cut sod walls, cottonwood ridgepole, hay roof, 3 weeks for a man and a team. Longer alone, but possible. Marit shook her head. "I measured it. A soddy that size needs more than 1,000 sod strips for 4 walls. I cannot cut that much alone before the first norther. I do not have a ridgepole. I do not have enough cottonwood for a roof frame. The wagon already has a floor, walls, and a frame. If I can move it under the bank, I have a room." Hester said nothing for a long time. Then she picked up the milk pail, poured half into a cup for Eli, and set the rest inside the wagon box. "If this fails," she said, "bring the boy to my place. Do not wait until it is too late to walk." She left without looking back at the bank. Marit watched her go. Then she picked up the axe and went back to the willow poles. The wood was green and flexible, and it smelled like river water, and her hands were already raw from cutting, and the wind had not stopped since Missouri. The question was no longer whether the idea could work. The question was whether she could move a wagon that weighed more than half a ton without a team, without a jack, and without another pair of hands. The news crossed the river settlements in 2 days. It moved the way all news moved on the plains, through freighters, mail riders, soldiers, and women carrying pails between homesteads. The Vangen widow was burying her wagon. A freighter named Sully stopped his mules on the road above the bank and watched Marit shoveling clay from the overhang base. He called down to his partner that the Norwegian woman was digging herself a badger hole. His partner laughed and said at least a badger had teeth. At the sutler's store near Fort Dodge, the clerk mentioned it to a cattle buyer, who mentioned it to 2 drovers who told it wrong. By the second telling, Marit was trying to bury a dead ox for warmth. By the third, she had lost her mind from grief and was covering the wagon in mud because she thought it would grow. Rulon Maddox heard it right. Maddox was 43, broad across the chest, and owned cattle he had not raised and land he had not broken. He had come to western Kansas the year before with capital from a failed freight venture in Topeka, and he had discovered that the cheapest way to assemble a ranch was to wait for settlers to fail. He had bought 3 claims already, 2 from widows, 1 from a man with consumption who signed over his quarter section for $12 and a ride to the rail station. Marit's claim sat on a bend of the Arkansas with good water access, shelter from summer wind, and grass that would feed cattle through autumn. Maddox had looked at it twice before Marit filed. He had assumed no one would hold it through winter. He rode to the wagon on the 3rd day after the oxen died. He brought 2 men. One stayed mounted. The other leaned against a cottonwood and rolled a cigarette. Maddox watched Marit cut willow poles and strip bark. He watched Eli stack peeled branches in a pile. He looked at the bank, at the wagon, at the trench Marit had started cutting below the overhang. "Mrs. Vangen," he said. He pronounced it wrong. "I heard about your team. Hard thing." Marit did not look up. I am prepared to offer $7 for your claim papers, Maddox said. That is more than you will get from Dodge City if you walk in with nothing to show in spring. I am not selling. Maddox smiled. It was not a kind smile. You have no team, no timber, no help, no roof. He nodded toward Eli. Tell the boy to remember where his mother is digging so men can find you after the snow. The man by the cottonwood laughed. Marit said nothing. She laid one willow pole across two stones, pressed her weight on it until it bowed, and marked it with her knife where it would need to be cut for a brace. $10, Maddox said. Marit cut the pole. After the first freeze, Maddox said, I will pay nothing. He mounted and rode east. His men followed. The dust they raised settled on the cut willow poles and on Eli's hair and on the flour sack with its tied corner, and Merritt kept working because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant counting, and the count was bad enough without adding Maddox to the column. She started trying to move the wagon on the fourth day. This was where the plan met the weight of the world. The box with its contents weighed more than 1,000 pounds. The broken wheels could not turn evenly. The ground between the wagon and the bank was uneven clay, rutted from old floodwater, and strewn with embedded stones that caught every edge. She tried pulling with the rope. The wagon did not move. She tried levering one corner with a fence post she had pulled from an old claim marker. The post slipped and drove into her thigh, leaving a bruise the color of a plum. She tried wetting the ground beneath the front skid, thinking the mud would let it slide. It sank instead, and she spent 2 hours digging the front corner free, while Eli held the shovel upright so she could find it. By the end of the fourth day, she had moved the wagon less than a hand's width. Her palms had split across the base of both thumbs. Her shoulders felt like someone had driven nails through them. She fed Eli beans and a half biscuit and put him to bed in the wagon box under every blanket they owned, and she sat on the ground outside with her hands in river water and counted what was left. $27, 32 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of beans, salt pork for maybe 6 days, half a quart of cottonwood, one shovel, one axe, one broken wagon that she needed to move 40 feet and could not shift 4 inches. The temperature had dropped every night since the oxen died. Frost came earlier and stayed later. The grass along the bank was turning pale, and the cottonwoods were bare except for a few leaves that rattled in the wind like old paper. Winter was not coming. Winter was walking toward her across the plains with its hands out, and she did not have a door to close. On the morning of the 5th day, Marit was kneeling beside the rear axle, trying to remove a broken wheel hub with the back of the axe head, when a shadow fell across the ground in front of her. She looked up and saw a man she had never met. He was stooped at the shoulders, 61 or 62, with a limp that favored his right side and hands that looked like they had been used as tools for 40 years. He carried a short iron bar in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. His name was Calvin T. Bledsoe. He had worked as a teamster and civilian mason at Fort Dodge for 11 years, repairing dugouts, hauling stone, building the sod and adobe quarters where soldiers lived. He had watched Marit from the river road for 2 days. He had watched her strip the harness, save the pins, cut the willow, and measure the bank. He had watched her fail to move the wagon, and he had come not because she was failing, but because she was failing the wrong way. "You are pulling like a mule," Calvin said. "Stop that." He set the iron bar on the wagon gate and looked at the bank. "Think like a jack." Marit stood up. Her hands were bleeding. Her shoulders ached. Eli was watching from the top of the bank with a cup of cold water he had carried from the river. "I do not have a jack," she said. Calvin picked up the fence post she had been using as a lever. He walked to the nearest flat stone, a piece of limestone half buried in clay, and set the base of the post against it. Then he worked the tip of the post under the rear corner of the wagon box, bracing it at an angle. "Push down," he said. Marit pushed. The wagon corner rose 1 inch. Calvin grabbed a flat piece of cottonwood and shoved it under the lifted edge before the post could slip. "That is cribbing," he said. "You lift an inch, you hold the inch, you lift again, you hold again. A man with a post and a stone can move anything on earth if he does not try to move it all at once." He looked at the bank again, then at the trench Marit had started, then at the stove visible through the torn canvas. "You have the right idea," he said. "You have the wrong sequence. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building?" Calvin stayed. He did not explain why. He did not offer charity, and Marit did not ask for it. What happened between them in the first hour was simpler than sympathy and more useful. He saw what she had saved, what she had measured, what she had planned, and he recognized the work of a mind that was solving a problem, not surrendering to one. He taught her 3 things before sundown. The first was leverage and cribbing. Every lift started from a fulcrum, the flat stone, a buried log, a wedged rock. The iron bar could find purchase where the fence post could not. Each inch gained was held with a block before the next inch began. "Never give back what you took," Calvin said. "The ground will swallow it." The second was rollers. They stripped the broken wheels and cut 2 cottonwood logs into short, thick sections. These were not meant to roll freely like wheels. They were meant to sit under the box and allow it to slide forward in controlled, agonizing inches when Marit pulled from a rope anchored to a dead man, a buried log with the rope lashed around it. Wetting the clay beneath the rollers with river water gave just enough slip without turning the surface to mud. The third lesson was the one Marit would carry longest. Calvin looked at the trench she had started below the overhang and shook his head. He told her she had dug it too shallow, too close to the threshold, and facing the wrong direction. "Water is more patient than weather," he said. "It will find you later if you do not find it first. Cut the trench before you move the shelter. Cut it deep enough to carry snow melt and spring seep. Angle it down slope away from the opening, not across it. If you build first and drain second, the water will make you pay for every day you made it wait." He picked up her shovel, set it into the clay at the far end of the overhang, and cut a line in the dirt that showed where the trench should run. Then he handed the shovel back. "Tomorrow we drain," he said. "The day after, we move the box. Not before." Marit looked at the sky. The clouds to the north were flat and gray, stacked like sheets of iron. The wind had shifted since morning. She could feel it now against the back of her neck. Colder than yesterday, steadier than yesterday, and coming from a direction that meant the plains were about to remember what season it was. She had 23 days of food if she cut rations hard. She had half a cord of wood. She had a wagon she could not yet move, a trench she had not yet dug, and a shelter that existed only as lines in river mud. And somewhere east, Rulon Maddox was waiting for the freeze that would make her choice for her. The sun dropped below the line of cottonwoods along the river, and the light turned the color of old iron, and the temperature began to fall. They started the trench at first light. Calvin marked the line with the tip of his iron bar, a shallow groove in the clay that ran from the downslope edge of the overhang at a steady angle away from where the wagon opening would sit. The trench needed to be 8 inches deep and 6 inches wide, enough to carry meltwater and spring seep without pooling at the threshold. He showed Marit how to test the slope by pouring a cup of water at the high end and watching it run. "If it stops," he said, You are building a bathtub. Dig until it moves. Marit dug. The clay was hard beneath the surface, denser than she expected, packed by years of flood sediment. Each shovel bite took effort. By mid-morning, her arms trembled, and the blisters from the previous day had opened and bled into her gloves. Eli carried the loose clay away in a canvas scrap, dumping it in a pile that Calvin told him to keep. They would need it later for packing. Calvin did not dig. His limp made shovel work dangerous on the slope, and his hands, though strong, had a tremor at rest that worsened with repetition. He stood above her and watched the angle, correcting with a word or a gesture when the trench drifted too far left. Once he stopped her entirely and made her re-pour the water. "There," he said, pointing at a spot where the stream slowed. "You left a lip. Cut it flat." She cut it flat. The water ran clean to the bottom. By afternoon, the trench was done. 18 feet of drainage that would carry water away from the shelter entrance and down toward the riverbed. Calvin tested it a third time with a full bucket. The water moved without hesitation, and he nodded once, the way a man nods when a thing has been done right and no praise is necessary. "Tomorrow," he said, "we move the box." Moving the wagon took 4 days. The first day they gained 4 inches. Calvin set the iron bar beneath the rear left corner, found purchase against a buried stone, and levered while Marit pulled from the front with the rope looped around the dead man anchor she had buried 20 feet ahead. The box groaned. The cottonwood rollers beneath it creaked and shifted. 4 inches. They cribbed the gain, wedging flat stones and cottonwood scraps beneath the skids so the box could not settle back. Then they reset the rollers, re-wet the clay, and did it again. 4 more inches. Eli hauled water from the river in the tin cup and a leaking bucket Marit had patched with pine pitch from a stump. He poured it ahead of the rollers where Calvin pointed, creating a slick surface that reduced the friction just enough. The boy did not complain. He worked with the focused silence of a child who understands that the adults around him are afraid, but does not yet understand of what. The second day, they gained a foot. Calvin showed Marit how to use the rope in a different configuration, a 2-to-1 purchase that doubled her pulling force at the cost of twice the rope travel. She had to pull 8 feet of rope to move the box 4 feet, but the strain on her shoulders dropped enough that she could work through the afternoon without stopping. The front corner jammed against a buried root on the third day. The root was cottonwood, thick as Marit's wrist, running just below the surface at an angle that caught the right front skid like a hook. They discovered it when the box lurched sideways and one roller split under the uneven load, cracking lengthwise with a sound like a pistol shot. Marit dropped the rope. The box sat crooked, one corner higher than the other, tilted against the root with the remaining roller pinched beneath it. The split roller was useless. She had one spare. Calvin limped down to the jammed corner and studied the root. He pressed the tip of the iron bar into the clay beside it and worked it loose enough to see the full diameter. Then he sat on a stone and said nothing for a long time. "Can we cut it?" Marit asked. "With what? The axe will not reach it under the box. The bar will not sever it. You could dig around it, but the box is sitting on the only angle where you can reach the root." Then we moved the box off the root. "The box weighs more than 1,000 pounds and is sitting on one roller. If we lever the jammed corner, the whole frame could twist and crack the sideboards." Marit looked at the root. She looked at the box. She looked at the iron bar. "What if we do not cut the root?" she said. "What if we use it?" She explained. If they could lever the front corner up high enough to clear the root, and if Eli packed wet clay on top of the root to create a ramp, the box could slide over it instead of catching against it. The root would become a guide rail, not an obstacle. Calvin stared at her. Then he picked up the bar. "That is either clever or stupid," he said. "We will find out which in about 10 minutes. It was clever. The front corner cleared the route with less than an inch of margin, grinding over the clay ramp with a sound that made Marit's teeth ache. The box settled onto the remaining roller and the replacement, and they gained 6 inches before dark. The fourth day, the box crossed the final distance and the front edge slid beneath the clay overhang. It nearly killed her. The ground under the bank sloped slightly inward, and the box, once it caught the angle, began to slide faster than the rollers could track. The rear corner swung outward. Marit was standing beside the left wall when it lurched, and the edge of the sideboard caught her hip and drove her against the clay bank. She heard something in her ribs shift, not break, but move in a way that ribs should not move, and she fell sideways into the drainage trench. Calvin shouted her name. Eli screamed from the top of the bank. The box slid another 8 inches and stopped, wedged beneath the overhang at a slight angle, the front end tucked under the clay lip and the rear end still exposed to open sky. Marit stood up. Her left side felt like someone had pressed a hot iron against it. She could breathe, but each breath cost her. "It is halfway," she said. Calvin looked at the position. He looked at Marit holding her ribs. He looked at the sky, which had turned the color of a bruise in the northwest. "Halfway is not shelter," he said. "Halfway is a coffin with the lid half shut." On the 5th day of moving the wagon, Hester Bell's oldest boy appeared at the bank. His name was Thomas. He was 14, big for his age, with his mother's wary eyes and his father's square hands. He carried a sack of turnips and did not explain why he had come. He simply set the turnips on the wagon gate, looked at the half-buried box, and asked Calvin what needed lifting. Hester had sent him. She would deny this later to anyone who asked, because helping a woman bury a wagon was not something a sensible neighbor admitted to encouraging. But she had sent the turnips, and she had sent the boy, and the boy had 2 hours before he needed to be back for evening chores. Thomas and Marit pulled the rope while Calvin levered. The box moved another 2 feet, then another. Then the rear edge cleared the bank's overhang, and the whole structure sat beneath the clay ceiling for the first time, 12 feet of wagon box tucked under 8 feet of earthen roof, with the rear wall still open to the south. Thomas left before dark. He paused on the road above the bank and looked down at what they had done. The wagon had disappeared. From the road, all that remained visible was the clay bank, the drainage trench, and a dark rectangle where the opening faced southeast. He did not wave. He walked home. The turnips lasted 4 days. With the box in position, the real work began. Marit packed clay against the exposed west side in layers. She started at the base, pressing wet clay into the gap between the wagon sideboards and the bank, then building outward in a slope that would shed rain and resist wind. Each layer was 3 to 4 inches thick, allowed to set for half a day before the next was applied. Between layers, she pressed cut prairie sod against the clay, root side inward, so the living roots would grip the clay and bind the wall together as they dried. Calvin supervised from the bank above, watching for cracks and checking the slope with a plumb line made from a stone and a piece of cord. He told her where to pack thicker, where to press harder, where to leave the sod loose enough to settle without pulling away from the clay beneath. "Do not fight the sod," he said. "It wants to hold. Let it hold." The work was brutal in its monotony. Cut sod, carry sod, pack clay, press sod into clay, check for gaps, fill gaps, wait, repeat. Marit's hands, which had healed enough to close after the first week, split again along different lines. Her hip, where the wagon had caught her, stiffened each morning and did not loosen until she had worked for an hour. She ate less each day, not because she chose to, but because preparing food took time she did not have, and the effort of eating sometimes felt larger than the effort of digging. Eli gathered fuel. He walked the riverbank, pulling dry cottonwood branches from deadfall, breaking them over his knee or under his boot, and stacking them in a pile that Calvin measured each evening. After the first week of construction, the pile had grown from half a cord to nearly 3/4. Not enough, not close to enough, but growing. The weather did not wait. The first frost that left ice on the water bucket came on the 9th of November. Marit woke to a white film inside the wagon box and realized the canvas remnants she had stretched over the opening were not stopping the cold air. She sealed the vestibule that morning, a narrow entry made from willow poles lashed together and covered with the last usable section of wagon canvas, with a rawhide flap hung inside as a second barrier. The entry was small enough that she had to crouch to pass through it. This was the point. A smaller opening lost less heat. Calvin taught her the chimney. He had brought a section of stovepipe from a ruined dugout near the fort, 3 feet of tin tube, dented but intact. He showed her where the bank thinned at the eastern edge of the overhang, a section where the clay was only 18 inches thick instead of 3 feet. They cut a hole through this section from inside, angling it upward so the pipe would exit at a slant. Then Calvin packed a collar of clay mixed with ash and chopped grass around the pipe, sealing the gap between metal and earth. "The collar will crack," he said. "Heat expands the pipe. The clay does not expand the same way. You will need to repatch this collar every week until the clay hardens fully. And if the wind drives smoke backward, you close the stove damper to a slit and wait. Never open the door and the damper at the same time. 1 draws, 2 creates a tunnel." Marit fired the stove for the first time on the 12th of November. She used a double handful of buffalo chips and 2 pieces of cottonwood, no thicker than her arm. The smoke rose through the pipe, curled once at the collar, and pulled clean into the open air above the bank. Inside the shelter, the temperature climbed from the low 40s to something Marit could not measure but could feel, a warmth that seemed to come not from the stove alone, but from the clay walls, the sod, the earth itself holding the heat instead of giving it back to the wind. She held a candle near the door crack. The flame bent slightly, then steadied. She held it near the wall seams. Steady. She held it near the pipe collar, and it flickered. She packed another strip of wet clay around the base and held the candle again. Steady. Calvin nodded. "There is your proof," he said. "Still air. You can heat still air." Sergeant Quince returned on the 14th of November. He was not on patrol this time. He had come alone, riding a bay horse that looked as tired as he did. He dismounted on the road above the bank and stood looking down at what had been an undercut clay shelf and a broken wagon, and was now something else. From above, the shelter was barely visible. The sod berm along the west side had grassed over slightly where the roots had taken, and the clay above the wagon blended with the natural bank. Only the dark entry, the thin curl of smoke from the angled pipe, and the drainage trench betrayed that anyone lived below. Quince climbed down and ducked inside. He stood in the cramped interior for a full minute without speaking. The stove was cold. Marit was rationing fuel, but the air was still and dry. The walls were solid. The roof, where the wagon bows braced against the underside of the clay overhang, did not sag. The sleeping shelf where Eli sat reading a torn almanac was dry. "You did this," Quint said. "Calvin Bledsoe helped." "Bledsoe is a mason with a bad leg. He cannot lift a shovel. You did this." He ran his hand along the clay-packed wall. He looked at the pipe collar, the stove placement, the drainage trench visible through the entry. Then he looked at Marit. I told you the choices were go back, sell out, or freeze, he said. I did not list this. You did not think of it. No, Quint said. I did not. He did not call it safe. He did not call it good. He told her the sky had the wrong color for mid-November, too pale in the north, too flat. He told her the horses at the fort had been turning their tails into the wind 2 days early, and the grass along the river had lain down as though something heavy were pressing on it from the north. A front is building, he said. I cannot say when. Days, maybe less. When it arrives, it will not come slowly. He left her with a piece of advice that had nothing to do with construction. If you hear the wind change direction twice in an hour, he said, close everything. Do not go outside for any reason. Do not open the flap to check. A blue norther can drop the temperature 40 degrees in the time it takes to walk a quarter mile. People die between the house and the barn. Marit watched him ride away. The sky behind him was exactly as he had described, pale, flat, and wrong. The shelter was as finished as time would allow. Marit made a list in her head the way her mother had taught her, counting on her fingers the things that stood between her and the weather. The wagon box, 12 feet of interior, dry, braced, sealed at the seams with clay and grass. The sod berm, 36 square feet of packed earth and living root along the exposed wall, sloped to shed rain. The overhang, the clay bank above, holding since before she arrived, roots threaded through the top like rope through canvas. The entry, narrow, double-flapped, facing southeast away from the prevailing wind. The stove, cracked leg braced on flat stones, pipe angled through the eastern thin spot, collar packed and repacked 3 times. The drainage trench, 18 feet, tested with water, running clean. Inside, the space was what it was, 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, and tall enough for Eli to sit on the sleeping shelf without hitting his head. Marit could crouch beside the stove and tend it. She could not stand fully upright. The walls smelled of clay and root and damp grass and wood smoke, a smell that was not pleasant and not unpleasant, but simply the smell of being enclosed in earth. Eli's shelf ran along the left wall, padded with folded canvas and the quilt Hester had brought. Below it, Marit stored the remaining food. 21 pounds of flour, 7 pounds of beans, a piece of salt pork the size of her fist, and the turnips Thomas had carried. Above the stove, on a shelf Calvin had fashioned from a split wagon board, sat a tin of matches, a candle stub, and the thermometer Calvin had left, a mercury instrument in a cracked wooden case that he said had belonged to a surgeon at the fort. Calvin tested the roof one last time. He drove a peeled willow rod into the bank above the overhang, pushing it down until it met resistance, then withdrew it and checked the tip for dampness. Dry for the first 2 feet, damp at the third. He looked at the spot where dampness began and frowned. There is a seam here, he said, pressing his boot into the grass above, where the overhang thins toward the edge. If rain sits on this spot long enough, it will find the inside. Can I seal it? Not from above. You would need to dig down and pack clay between the layers, and if you dig in the wrong place, you weaken what is already holding. He looked at her. Keep the stove small and steady. Never let it roar. Sudden heat dries the clay unevenly, and uneven clay cracks. If you see a wet spot on the ceiling, put a rag under it and keep the fire low. A slow seep you can manage. A crack you cannot. He coughed. A deep, wet sound that had been growing worse since the cold turned. He pressed his fist against his chest and waited for it to pass. Calvin, Marit said, it is nothing. Old lungs and old weather. He picked up his iron bar and the coil of rope. If the front hits hard, do not open the door. Not for me, not for anyone, not for any reason until the wind stops. The shelter works because the air inside is still. The moment you open that flap, you invite the wind inside, and it will take everything the stove has given you. He did not say goodbye. He said he would come back after the weather broke. Marit watched him limp up the bank, the iron bar over his shoulder like a soldier's rifle, and she did not know that she would not see him again for 11 days. The blue norther came on the 17th of November. The morning was mild, warm enough that the mud softened and the drainage trench ran with a thin stream of snow melt from the previous night's light frost. Marit washed clothes in a bucket and hung them on the willow poles near the entry. Eli found a beetle on the bank and watched it walk across his palm. The sky to the south was the color of old butter. By noon, the northern horizon had changed. It started as a line, hard, blue-black, straight as a carpenter's rule, stretching east to west across the full width of the sky. It did not look like weather. It looked like the edge of something solid, a wall of dark glass being pushed south across the plains by a hand too large to see. The wind shifted. It had been coming from the southwest all morning, carrying the last warmth of a season that was already borrowed time. Then it stopped. For perhaps 10 minutes, nothing moved. The grass stood upright. The hung clothes hung limp. The beetle on Eli's hand froze in place. Then the wind hit from the north. It did not build. It arrived. One moment, stillness. The next, a sound like canvas tearing across the sky. A continuous roar that was not a gust, but a current. A river of air moving so fast that it carried dust before it carried cold. The temperature dropped. Marit felt it on her face first. A tightening of the skin, a sharpness in the nostrils, a sting across the eyes. She grabbed Eli's arm and pulled him toward the entry. The clothes she had hung were gone, torn from the willow poles and carried south in the first 30 seconds. The bucket she had washed them in tumbled down the bank and vanished into the river brush. They were inside the shelter before the sleet began. The first sound was the wind on the bank. Not against the wagon, the bank stood between the wind and the wall, the sod berm curving the airflow up and over the way a stone in a stream parts water. The sound was above them, a low, sustained howl that vibrated the roots in the clay ceiling but did not penetrate the interior. The stove flame bent once when a gust found the pipe, then steadied. Marit lit the stove with chips and 2 small pieces of cottonwood. She closed the damper to the slit Calvin had taught her. The flame burned low and yellow, feeding on limited air, pushing heat into the clay walls that held it and returned it slowly. Within an hour, the thermometer by the stove read 58 degrees. Outside, the temperature had already dropped below 20. Then Eli coughed. It was not a new cough. He had been coughing since Missouri, short, dry, the kind that children carry through autumn and shed by spring. But in the sealed air of the shelter, with dust from the clay walls and smoke residue from the stove's first firings, the cough deepened. By the second hour of the storm, his forehead was hot. By the third, he was shaking under the quilt. Marit faced the first impossible arithmetic of the crisis. The shelter needed to stay warm for the child, but the stove needed air to burn, and air fed the smoke that made the cough worse. She could open the damper to clear the smoke, but that would draw cold air through the entry and cool the shelter. She could close the damper further, but that would kill the flame. She could open the door flap, but Calvin had told her never to do that in a norther, and the wind outside was now screaming. She chose the middle. She cracked the damper 1 notch wider than Calvin's slit, hung a damp rag over Eli's face to filter the air he breathed, and pressed her hand against the clay wall near the pipe collar. Cool, No heat was escaping through the seal. The smoke was pulling, not perfectly, but enough. She could smell it, taste it in the back of her throat, but the air was not thick. The boy could breathe. Then the pipe began to thrum. The sound started low, a vibration in the tin that she felt through the stove before she heard it. Wind pressure above the bank was creating a downdraft at the pipe's exit, pushing air backward through the flue. Smoke leaked from the damper joint. Not much. A thread of gray that curled toward the ceiling and spread. If the backdraft worsened, the shelter would fill with smoke. If she opened the door to vent it, the wind would enter and the temperature would collapse. Eli's fever was climbing. The math was narrowing. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether Marit built a refuge or sealed herself inside a trap. Marit tied a rawhide strip around her waist. She gave the other end to Eli and told him to hold it, no matter what. Then she pulled the inner flap aside, pushed through the vestibule on her hands and knees, and reached into the screaming dark outside. The wind hit her like a fist of ice. She could not see. Snow was not falling. It was moving sideways, horizontal, a white blur that erased the world 3 feet from the entry. She reached upward along the outer wall of the vestibule, found the stovepipe where it exited the bank, and felt for the shield Calvin had fashioned, a curved piece of tin nailed to a cottonwood block, set above the pipe mouth to deflect direct downdraft. The shield had shifted. The wind had pushed it sideways, and the pipe mouth was exposed to the full force of the norther. Marit grabbed the shield with both hands and wrenched it back into position, then jammed a stone against the base to hold it. The wind tore at her coat and drove snow into her collar and ears. Her fingers, bare against the tin, went numb in seconds. She crawled back inside. The rawhide strip was taut. Eli had held it. She sealed the inner flap and the vestibule and pressed clay into the gaps around the doorframe with shaking hands. The thrumming stopped. The smoke thinned. The stove flames steadied, and the pipe drew clean. Marit sat on the floor with her back against the clay wall and held her frozen hands against the side of the stove until feeling returned as pain. Eli's cough had quieted. His forehead was still hot, but his breathing had settled. The thermometer read 61 degrees. Outside, the wind had not slowed. It had not paused. It had not done anything except continue. The pounding on the outer flap came 3 hours after dark. Marit heard it first as part of the storm, an irregular thudding that could have been debris against the bank. Then it came in a pattern. 3 hits, a pause, 3 more. A human rhythm. She pushed through the vestibule and pulled the outer flap aside an inch. The wind screamed through the gap. Snow blasted across her face. Thomas Bell stood in the entrance, white from head to boots, holding his youngest sister against his chest. The girl was 4. She was not crying. She was not moving. Her eyes were open and her lips were blue. Behind Thomas, coming down the bank slope on her hands and knees, with the second child clinging to her back, was Hester Bell. Their sod roof had peeled back at the northwest corner. The wind had found the seam where the ridgepole met the wall, and once it found the seam, it tore the sod away in sheets. Within minutes, the interior was open to the storm. Hester had gathered the children and run, not to the road, not to another neighbor, but south along the river to the one shelter she knew was underground. Marit pulled the little girl inside first, then Thomas, then Hester, who fell through the entry on her stomach and lay on the dirt floor coughing while snow melted from her hair. The shelter built for 2 now held 5. The heat vanished the instant the door opened. The thermometer dropped from 61 to 43 in the time it took to seal the flaps again. Marit fed the stove, more than Calvin's cautious ration, more than she could afford, and pressed everybody closer to the warmth. Hester's children went on the sleeping shelf with Eli. Hester sat on the floor. Marit crouched by the stove. The space was suffocating. 5 people breathing in a room 12 feet by 4 feet. The air grew heavy with moisture and warmth and the smell of wet wool and fear. But the walls held. The bank above them held. The sod berm outside deflected the wind, and the drainage trench carried away the meltwater that trickled beneath the entry. The stove burned, the pipe drew. The clay did not crack. Outside, the norther killed. 2 miles east, a neighbor's frame lean-to, built from cottonwood poles and buffalo hide, collapsed under wind that hit the broad face of its wall like a battering ram. The man inside crawled out and reached his dugout, but 2 of his chickens froze where they stood. A freighter caught on the river road overturned his wagon and sheltered beneath it, but the wind found every gap and his left hand turned black by morning. He would lose 3 fingers at the fort surgeon's table. One of Maddox's hired men, a cattle hand who had been riding fence when the storm hit, tried to reach the line camp on the South Fork. He did not reach it. They found him 2 days later, seated against a fence post with his coat buttoned to the throat, as though he had decided to rest and simply not resumed. The blue norther held for 31 hours. The wind sustained gusts that bent mature cottonwoods to the ground and drove snow into drifts that buried fence lines and filled creek beds. The temperature, which had been in the mid-40s when the front arrived, fell to 9 degrees below zero by midnight and stayed there until the following afternoon. Sergeant Quince attempted a patrol during a lull 6 hours into the storm and was forced back within a mile. His horse refused the open flat, planted its hooves, and would not move into the wind. Quince turned the animal and rode with the storm at his back to the fort, where he stabled the horse and stood in the doorway of the barracks looking north. He thought about the clay bank 12 miles west. He thought about the wagon buried beneath it. He thought about the woman he had told to go back or freeze. Inside the shelter, the hours passed in a rhythm dictated by the stove. Marit fed it every 40 minutes. Small pieces, cottonwood scraps broken to the length of her forearm, supplemented with buffalo chips and twisted grass. Calvin had said, small and steady, never roaring, never starving. The stove was the heartbeat. If it stopped, the shelter would cool in an hour. If it flared, the clay would dry and crack, and the pipe collar would gap. Hester's youngest daughter warmed slowly. Her color returned. She slept against Eli on the shelf. The 2 children curled together under the quilt like animals in a den. Thomas sat with his back against the far wall and did not sleep. He watched the door. Hester asked Marit how the smoke drew so cleanly with only 1 pipe. Marit explained the angle, the collar, the damper slit. Hester looked at the walls, the clay and sod packed tight, the roots visible where they gripped the surface, the wagon bows bracing the ceiling against the bank above. She pressed her palm against the wall, the way Marit had pressed hers against the bank on the first day. "It is warm," Hester said. "The earth holds what the stove gives. The wind cannot take what it cannot touch. I told you the bank would cave. It has not caved. I told you the smoke would kill you. It has not killed us." Hester closed her eyes. The wind screamed above them. The stove ticked. The children breathed. "I was wrong," Hester said. In the early hours of the morning, Eli's fever broke. Marit felt it in his forehead, the heat pulling back like a tide going out. He opened his eyes and asked for water. She gave him water from the bucket they had filled before the storm, and he drank, and he slept again. The thermometer by the stove read 70 degrees. 5 bodies, 1 stove, 12 feet of wagon box sealed in earth. Outside, the mercury in the water bucket Marit had left by the entry had frozen solid. The temperature difference between inside and outside was more than 80 degrees. But the 70 was not magic. It was not the earth alone. It was a tiny space packed with people, insulated by clay and sod, and a bank of ancient river sediment, heated by a stove burning fuel at a rate Marit could sustain, in still air that did not move. Every element mattered. Remove one, the seal, the bank, the bodies, the fuel, and the number would fall. Marit knew this. She sat with her back against the warm wall and listened to the storm trying to find her. It could not. The wind went over. The snow went over. The cold pressed against the earth, and the earth pressed back. And inside the buried wagon on the Arkansas River, 5 people breathed through the night that killed a man 2 miles east who had been sitting against a fence post in a good coat with nothing between him and the wind but faith in canvas. The storm broke at noon the following day. The wind died in stages, roaring, then moaning, then sighing, then still. Marit pushed through the vestibule and stood outside for the first time in 31 hours. The world was white and silent. Snow covered everything: the bank, the berm, the drainage trench, the road above. The shelter from outside looked like a smooth white mound in the riverbank. The stove pipe protruded from the snow like a dark finger, and a thin curl of smoke rose from it into air so cold it seemed to shatter. She stood there with cracked hands and a bruised hip and eyes that watered in the glare, and she breathed air that tasted like iron and silence, and the shelter behind her was still warm. Sergeant Quince arrived at the bank on horseback 2 days after the storm broke. He brought a private and a mule loaded with army rations, hardtack, salt beef, and a sack of dried corn that had been meant for the fort's horses. He stood on the road above the shelter and looked down. The snow had sculpted the berm into a smooth white curve that followed the line of the bank. The stovepipe rose from the surface like a reed from a frozen pond. From above, the shelter did not look like a structure. It looked like the earth had simply chosen not to be disturbed. Quince climbed down. He ducked through the vestibule and stood inside, and for the second time in a month, he said nothing for a long while. The interior was unchanged. 5 people had lived in it for 31 hours, and the walls had not wept. The ceiling had not sagged, and the floor was dry. The stove sat cold. Marit was conserving fuel in the calm after the storm, but the air was still above freezing. The clay held warmth the way a stone holds the sun's heat after dark, releasing it slowly, evenly, without wind to carry it away. Quince removed his gloves. He pressed his bare hand against the inner wall, the packed clay and sod that Marit had built layer by layer against the exposed side of the wagon box. He held it there for 5 seconds. "Warm," he said. "The earth remembers," Marit said. "It takes heat slowly and gives it back slowly. The stove has been cold for 6 hours. Quince looked at the pipe collar, the drainage trench visible through the entry, the sleeping shelf where Eli sat with Hester's youngest daughter, asleep against his shoulder. He looked at the wagon bows bracing the ceiling. He looked at the rawhide flap and the clay-sealed seams and the willow rod Calvin had driven into the bank to test for dampness. "I called this wagon lumber," Quince said. "I told you the choices were go back, sell out, or freeze. I was wrong. You made it a fort." Marit did not answer immediately. She was looking at the ration sack the private had carried down from the mule. "How many died?" she asked. "One that I know of, Maddox's man, on the South Fork. A freighter lost fingers. 3 families lost roofing. 1 dugout flooded after the melt started." "The lean-to east of here?" "Collapsed. The man survived. His animals did not." Quince set the rations on the floor beside the stove. He told her the fort would send a work detail in spring to help settlers repair storm damage. He told her they would not reach her claim. Too far west, too few men. But he would note in his report that the Vangen claim was occupied and improved. Then he said something he had not planned to say. I have wintered on these plains 9 times. I have seen men with timber, teams, full crews, and 6 months of preparation lose their shelters in a single night. You had a broken wagon and a shovel. He pulled his gloves back on. I do not understand how this works, but it works. He left the rations and rode east. The private followed, and the mule followed the private, and the sound of hooves on frozen ground faded, and Merritt stood in the entry of the shelter she had built from a dead woman's memory, and a teamster's patience, and 3 weeks of work that had cost her the skin on both hands. Hester Bell's conversion happened without ceremony. She stayed in the shelter for 2 days after the storm, until Thomas could patch the sod roof enough to keep weather out. On the morning she left, she stood outside the entry and looked at the berm, the trench, the angled pipe, the way the snow had flowed over the shelter instead of piling against it. Show me the trench, she said. Marit showed her. The drainage channel, half filled with ice and meltwater, still running downslope. Hester crouched beside it and traced the angle with her finger. How deep? 8 inches, 6 wide. Calvin said deeper is better, but I ran out of time. Calvin Bledsoe told you this? He showed me. He said water is more patient than weather. Hester stood up and brushed the snow from her knees. She looked at Marit the way one woman looks at another when a judgment is being revised, not with shame because Hester was not ashamed of her doubt, but with the careful attention of someone who has decided to learn. If I bring you clay from the creek bank east of my place, Hester said, will you tell me where to dig? I will come look at the bank myself. Not every bank is safe. The clay must be dry under the lip, and the roots must hold the top layer, and the overhang must have survived at least 1 flood season without calving. If any of those are wrong, you build somewhere else. Hester nodded. She gathered her children and walked east along the river road, and the youngest girl waved at Eli from her mother's hip. Within a week, 3 families sent word asking about the shelter. The first was a German settler named Martha Royce, who lived 4 miles south with her husband and an infant son. Their dugout had flooded during the storm's melt, and the walls were weeping clay. She wanted to know whether the wagon method could be adapted with a hand cart instead of a prairie schooner. The second was a widower named Doss Embry, who farmed a quarter section north of the river. His sod roof had held, but his fuel supply was gone, burned through in 31 hours of storm, and he wanted to know how Marit's shelter had stayed warm on so little wood. The third was a letter carried by a sutler's clerk from a family Marit had never met, asking whether the buried wagon was real or a story someone had made up to sell newspapers. Marit answered each one the same way. She drew the design in dirt, the bank, the box, the berm, the trench, the pipe, the entry. She used numbers. She used her hands. She told Marta Rice that a handcart was too small for a family, but could work as a storage vault if bermed correctly. She told Doss Embry that fuel efficiency came from still air and thermal mass. Those were not her words, but the principle was hers. A sealed space loses heat slowly because there is no wind to carry it away, and the earth surrounding the space absorbs heat and returns it, which means the stove works less. She told the letter-writing family that the shelter was real and that it had held 5 people through the worst night of the season, and that anyone who wanted to see it could walk to the bend of the Arkansas, 12 miles west of Fort Dodge, and look for the smoke. She did not call it an invention. She called it listening. Listening to wind, to clay, to water, and to what old hands tried to teach before they were gone. Rulon Maddox did not come to see the shelter. He did not send word. He did not acknowledge that his hired man had died in a storm, that Merritt's wagon had survived. What he did was talk. At the sutler's store, he told the clerk that luck had saved the Vangan woman. Luck and a freak of geography. The bank happened to face the right direction. The wind happened to miss the opening. The stove happened not to smoke. Any fool could survive one storm in a hole. The question was whether the hole would last. He told the cattle buyer from Topeka that Marriott was teaching women to dig their own graves, and that the first heavy rain would expose the fraud. He told the freighter Sully that the shelter was a novelty, not a method, that real winter survival required timber, pitch, and a man who knew how to swing an axe. The talk did not land the way it once had. Before the storm, Maddox's voice carried the weight of a man with money and cattle and the confidence that comes from buying what others could not hold. After the storm, the weight had shifted. His man was dead. His line camp had been damaged. 3 of his cattle had frozen in a draw. And 12 miles west, a woman with a broken wagon and a shovel had kept 5 people alive in a space the size of a horse stall. The community did not turn on Maddox. That was not how plain settlements worked, but they stopped repeating his words as though they were verdicts. When he said the shelter was luck, men who had seen the snow pattern on the bank, the smooth flow over the berm, the absence of drifting against a vertical wall, said nothing and changed the subject. Silence on the plains was its own judgment. Calvin returned 11 days after the storm. He walked from the east, carrying the iron bar and nothing else. His limp was worse. His cough, which had been a low rumble before the norther, now broke through in fits that bent him at the waist. He had spent the storm in a dugout near the fort with 2 soldiers and a sutler's dog, and the damp had settled into his lungs like a tenant who would not leave. Marriott met him at the top of the bank. She did not ask where he had been. She brought him inside and gave him broth made from the salt beef Quince had left, and Calvin sat on the floor beside the stove and drank it slowly, holding the tin cup in both hands. "The pipe drew clean," he said. It was not a question. He could see it in the walls. No smoke staining, no soot rings around the collar. The shield shifted in the wind. I crawled out and reset it. Calvin set the cup down. "You went outside during the norther?" The backdraft was filling the shelter. Eli was sick. Calvin said nothing for a long time. He looked at the pipe collar, at the shield outside the entry, at the rawhide strip still tied to the vestibule post where Eli had held the other end. "I told you not to open the door," he said. "You also taught me how the pipe works. I could not fix it from inside." He laughed. It turned into a cough that lasted 30 seconds, and when it ended, his eyes were wet and his hand was shaking against the stove. "You are better at this than I was at your age," he said, "and I had 2 good legs." They worked together through the rest of November and into December. The collaboration had changed. Calvin no longer stood above and directed. He sat beside her and discussed. They improved the entry, adding a double flap system with a willow mat between the layers that blocked wind without blocking passage. They built a clay lip across the bottom of the threshold that stopped drifting snow from creeping inward. They constructed a small exterior snow fence from brush and cottonwood stakes, angled to catch snow before it reached the entry and pile it harmlessly to the side. Calvin's backstory emerged in pieces during the work. He had been born in Tennessee, the son of a carpenter who built tobacco barns. He had gone west after the war, he did not say which side, and found work at Fort Dodge hauling stone and mixing mortar. He had learned masonry from a Mexican adobe builder named Estrada, who taught him that earth was not a lesser material but a different one with its own rules about moisture, compression, and time. He had never married. He had never filed a claim. He had lived in other people's structures his entire life, repairing what others built, and he told Marit that watching her build something from nothing was the first time he had seen his own knowledge used for something that mattered more than a wall. They disagreed once, sharply. Marit wanted to widen the shelter by digging into the bank on the left side, carving out another 2 feet of space so Eli could sleep without his feet touching the wall. Calvin said no. Digging into the bank weakened the overhang, and the clay on the left side was softer than the right. He could tell by the sound it made when he tapped it with the iron bar. A hollow tap meant air pockets. Air pockets meant the clay could shift. Marit argued. Eli was growing. The space was too small for a child who would spend months inside. Then build him a shelf that extends toward the entry, Calvin said. Do not take from the bank what the bank is not offering. The bank held through the norther. The bank held at its current shape. You change the shape, you change what it can hold. I have seen men dig 1 foot too far into a wall and bring down a ceiling that had stood for years. Marit looked at the left wall. She looked at Eli, who was watching them from the sleeping shelf with the careful attention of a child who has learned that adults arguing about walls are arguing about whether he will be alive in spring. She did not dig. She extended the sleeping shelf with a plank Calvin cut from the remaining wagon sideboards, and Eli's feet no longer touched the wall, and the bank kept its shape. Calvin's cough did not improve. Through December, it deepened, and by early January, the fits came with a sound that Marit recognized from Missouri, the wet, tearing rasp that had preceded her husband's death. She did not say this to Calvin. She heated stones on the stove and wrapped them in cloth and set them against his chest when he slept, and she brewed willow bark tea that he drank without complaint, and she watched his face thin and his hands lose their steadiness. He taught her 3 more things before the cold took his strength. The first was how to read failure signs. Fresh cracks in the bank above the overhang meant settling. Wet streaks on the inner wall meant seepage from above, not condensation. The direction of the streak told you where the water was entering. Mouse holes in the sod berm meant the wall was drying unevenly, and small animals were finding the warm side. A hollow sound when you tapped the bank with a pole meant the clay had separated from the root mat, and weight above could bring it down. The second was how to teach someone else. Do not tell them what to do, Calvin said. Show them what happens when they do it wrong. A person remembers a mistake they made longer than an instruction they heard. The third was about Marit herself. He said it on a morning in late January when the sun came through the entry at an angle that lit the interior wall like the inside of a clay bowl. You came here with a dead team and a claim receipt, he said. You will leave here with something no receipt can hold. You know how to make the earth keep people alive. That is worth more than 160 acres, and it cannot be taken by any man with a piece of paper. He moved to Hester Bell's house in early February. The shelter was too cramped for a man who needed to lie flat, and Hester had a cot and a stove that burned hotter. Calvin did not want to go. He said he had slept in too many barracks and too many strangers' rooms, and that the buried wagon was the first place in years that felt like it had been built for a reason. Marit told him the reason would still be there when he came back. He did not come back. Cal Van T. Bledsoe died on the 14th of February, 1882, in Hester Bell's house, with a sound of wind in the sod roof above him and the taste of willow bark tea in his mouth. He had asked Marit to keep his iron bar. She had taken it the day he left the shelter and set it by the door, where it leaned against the clay wall with dried mud still on the shaft from the first day he had helped her move the wagon. Hester sent Thomas with the news. The boy stood outside the shelter and delivered it in 3 sentences. Calvin had stopped breathing in the night. He had not been in pain. He had asked about the pipe collar. Marit did not go to the burial. She sat inside the shelter with the iron bar across her knees and listened to the wind pass over the bank, and the sound was the same sound it had always been, the long, low breath of moving air that could not find what it was looking for. She had known Calvin Bledsoe for 37 days. He had taught her to lift with a stone and a post, to move weight in inches, to drain before she sheltered, to read clay by its sound, and to never take from the earth what the earth was not offering. He had recognized her competence when the world saw only her widowhood, and he had treated her not as a woman to be rescued, but as a builder to be taught. The iron bar stayed by the door for the rest of Marit's life. Years later, when visitors asked about it, she said it belonged to a man who understood that the most useful thing you could give someone was not your labor, but your knowledge of where to place theirs. The secondary crisis came with the thaw. Late February brought 3 days of warm rain, a false spring that melted the snowpack along the Arkansas and sent water down every channel, gully, and trench that gravity could find. The river rose 4 feet in 2 days. The drainage trench that had carried meltwater cleanly all winter now choked with ice and mud, backing up toward the shelter's threshold. Marit discovered it at dawn when her foot touched water on the shelter floor. A thin sheet, barely an inch, but moving, spreading, seeping under the sleeping shelf and darkening the packed earth beneath the stove. She remembered Calvin's rule. Water is more patient than weather. It will find you later if you do not find it first. She did not wait for the water to find anything else. She pulled on her coat, grabbed the shovel, and crawled outside into the rain. The drainage trench was visible as a line of ice-choked mud running along the base of the bank. Somewhere in the middle, a plug of frozen clay had blocked the channel, and the meltwater was pooling behind it, rising until it overflowed the trench lip and ran toward the entry. Marit dug. In the dark, in the rain, with the river roaring below her and the bank slick with mud, she cut a relief trench, a bypass channel that ran around the blockage and rejoined the main trench below it. The clay was soft from the rain and came apart in heavy slabs. She worked for 2 hours, her boots filled with water. Her hands, which had finally healed after months of splitting and mending, cracked again along the old lines. Eli stood in the entry with a pan, bailing the water that had reached the floor. Hester arrived at first light with her oldest boy, and Thomas shoveled alongside Marit until the bypass trench ran clear and the pooling water drained away from the shelter in a brown stream that carried mud and ice chips toward the river. The water on the floor dried by midday. The stove helped. The clay walls absorbed the moisture and released it slowly over the next week, leaving a faint damp smell that faded as the air warmed. The shelter held. The method held. But the thaw had exposed a weakness that Calvin would have caught. The original trench design had no overflow capacity. A single blockage could turn the drainage system into a dam. Marit spent the next week cutting a second trench parallel to the first, connected by 2 cross channels that could carry water around any single point of failure. She was doing Calvin's work now, alone. Maddox made his mistake in March. He had lost cattle in the winter, lost a hired man, and lost the quiet authority that came from being the man in the district who always seemed to profit while others failed. The shelter's survival had not humbled him, but it had made him greedy in a new direction. If the method worked, he wanted it, not as knowledge, but as advantage. He sent 2 of his remaining hands to dig a bermed shelter into a clay bank on the South Fork, 3 miles from his main camp. The bank faced northwest, expulsor, wrong, but Maddox did not ask Marit. and his men did not know the difference. They dug without draining first. They packed sod against the outer wall without checking whether the roots would grip the clay. They ran the stovepipe straight through the bank instead of angling it through a thin section. Marit heard about it from Doss Embry, who had ridden past the site and seen the work. She sent word through Thomas Bell, asking Maddox's men to stop and let her inspect the bank before they continued. The message came back through the sutler's clerk. Maddox had said he did not need a widow's permission to dig on his own land. The copied shelter lasted 3 weeks. The thaw that had threatened Marit's trench destroyed Maddox's bank. Water seeped through the unprotected top layer, saturated the clay behind the sod, and the outer wall slumped inward on a warm afternoon in mid-March. The 2 men inside heard the cracks, the sound Calvin had described, the sound that means the clay is separating from the root mat, and they ran. One of them made it clear. The other was caught below the waist by falling sod and clay, and lay pinned for 2 hours before his partner dug him free. The man lived. His right leg was broken below the knee, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, a limp not unlike Calvin Bledsoe's, though earned in a different kind of failure. Maddox did not visit the injured man. He did not visit Marit. He told the sutler's clerk that the method was dangerous and that the Vangen woman was teaching people to get themselves killed. But the community had seen both shelters. They had seen Marit's bank, which had held through a norther and a thaw, and still stood dry and solid on the bend of the Arkansas. And they had seen Maddox's bank, which had collapsed in 3 weeks because the man who ordered it built did not understand that the method was not a shape. It was a set of rules about clay, about water, about wind, about which banks offered themselves and which ones waited to punish the careless. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built before the danger arrives. Marit visited the injured man at Maddox's camp. She brought willow bark tea and a splint she had made from a wagon spoke and strips of canvas. The man's name was Gideon Pace. He was 26 from Missouri, and he told Marit that Maddox had ordered the shelter dug in 2 days. 2 days for work that had taken Marit and Calvin 3 weeks. He said it was just dirt and sticks, Gideon said. He said if a woman could do it, 2 men could do it faster. Marit set the splint and wrapped it tight. She told Gideon that dirt and sticks could keep a person alive or kill them, and the difference was not speed. It was attention. She walked home along the river in the late afternoon light. The cottonwoods were beginning to bud. The ice on the Arkansas had broken into gray plates that ground against each other in the current. Spring was coming, the season that would prove whether the shelter was a winter trick or a permanent structure, whether the bank would dry and harden or crack and calve in the summer heat. Marit had $21 left. She had Eli, who was taller than he had been in October, and who had started drawing maps of the riverbank in the dirt with a stick, marking the places where the clay was hard and the places where it was soft, the way Calvin had taught her to read them. She had a shelter that smelled like earth and smoke and survival. She had an iron bar by the door, and she had something she had not had when she arrived, people who came to her with questions instead of verdicts, people who knocked on her entry flap not to warn her, but to learn, people who looked at the buried wagon on the Arkansas and saw not a grave but a grammar, a set of rules about wind and clay and patience that could be learned and repeated and passed on. The question was no longer whether Marit could survive. The question was whether she could teach well enough to keep others from making the mistakes that the earth would not forgive. Spring arrived on the Arkansas not as warmth, but as mud. The snow retreated in stages through March and April, leaving behind a landscape of brown grass, swollen creeks, and clay that stuck to everything it touched. The river rose and fell with each rain, and the cottonwoods along the bank put out leaves so pale they looked white in the morning light. Marit opened the shelter's entry flap for the first time since November and let the air move through the interior, not wind but breeze, the kind of gentle current that dried the clay walls and carried the winter smell of smoke and earth out into the open. The shelter had survived. Not just the norther, not just the thaw, but the full cycle: freeze, storm, melt, flood, and the slow return of warmth that tested every seal, every joint, every inch of packed clay and rooted sod. The berm along the west wall had settled 2 inches but had not cracked. The pipe collar needed repatching where heat expansion had opened a hairline gap. The drainage trench, rebuilt with the parallel bypass, ran clean. Marit spent the first week of April making improvements she had planned through the winter months but could not execute in cold. She raised the sleeping shelf on cottonwood blocks, 3 inches higher, enough to keep bedding clear of any future floor seep. She lined the shelf underneath with a clay-packed tray that Calvin would have called a cold shelf, a space near the floor where the temperature stayed lower than the rest of the room and where food could be stored without spoiling as quickly in warm weather. She built a smoke shelf above the stove, a small clay ledge that interrupted the direct path between the fire and the pipe, forcing smoke to curl before it entered the flue. This slowed the draws slightly, but prevented sparks from riding the updraft into the pipe and lodging against the clay collar. She added willow lattice to the inner face of the sod berm, thin strips woven horizontally and pressed into the clay, creating a mesh that held the sod in place during the seasonal expansion and contraction that came with wet and dry cycles. The lattice was not structural, it was insurance. Calvin had not taught her this. She had invented it after watching sod settle unevenly on the berm's upper section and imagining what would happen if the settling continued over years. The improvements took 2 weeks. When they were finished, the shelter was not the desperate hole she had crawled into in November. It was a built thing, considered, refined, understood. The teaching began in earnest that spring. Marta Ruiz came first. She brought her infant son strapped to her chest and her husband trailing behind, carrying a shovel that was too large for the work and a skepticism that was too large for the situation. Marit walked them to 3 different banks along the creek south of their dugout. She rejected the first because the clay showed seepage stains, dark vertical streaks that meant water was moving through the bank from above. She rejected the second because the overhang was too shallow and the root mat too thin. She accepted the third, a south-facing cut with dense clay, deep roots, and a natural drainage slope. She taught Marta to test the clay by rolling a piece into a coil the width of her finger and bending it slowly. If it cracked before it reached a right angle, the clay was too dry and would not bond with sod. If it bent without cracking, it would pack well. If it felt greasy and stuck to her hands, it had too much moisture and would shrink as it dried, opening gaps in the wall. Marta's husband watched with his arms folded. He asked whether a proper dugout with timber framing would not be safer. Marit told him that a proper dugout with timber framing would be better in every way, and that if he had the timber, the time, and the team to build one, he should. He had none of those things. He unfolded his arms and picked up the shovel. Marit taught Hester Bell's children how to cut sod. The key, she showed them, was the angle of the blade. A vertical cut gave you a sod strip with clean edges but weak root structure because the deepest roots ran horizontally, and a vertical blade severed them. A blade angled 15 degrees from vertical caught the root network and pulled it intact, producing a strip that held together when lifted and gripped clay like a hand closing. She taught Doss Embry how to site a drainage trench by pouring water and watching it run. She taught him the bypass system she had built after the thaw, the parallel trench, the cross channels, The principle that any single point of failure in a drainage system was an invitation to flood the shelter at the worst possible moment. She taught everyone the same warning first: not every bank is safe. A bad bank is worse than no bank. She described the sounds: the hollow tap of separated clay, the wet thud of saturated earth, the dry crack of a bank that was drying too fast in summer heat. She told them to walk away from a bank that made any of those sounds, no matter how good the overhang looked or how close the winter felt. 3 families built variations that spring. None used a wagon box. Marit's had been a circumstance, not a requirement. 2 used cottonwood pole frames set into the bank, with sod walls and clay packing on the exposed sides. 1 used a handcart frame as a storage extension, the way Marit had suggested to Marta Royce. All 3 included drainage trenches, angled entries, and pipe collars packed with clay and ash. Marit inspected each one before the families moved in. She rejected 1 pipe installation. The angle was too steep, and the draw would fail in high wind, and she made Doss Embry widen his trench by 2 inches after she poured water and watched it pool at a spot where the grade flattened. Small corrections. The kind of corrections that Calvin would have made with a nod and a pointed finger, and that Marit now made with the same economy of gesture, because she had learned that a builder's authority came not from the volume of their voice, but from the precision of their attention. The final reckoning with Rulon Maddox came in May. It did not come in winter. It did not come in snow or cold or the grinding arithmetic of survival. It came on a clear spring afternoon when the sky turned brown. A dust gale, fast, dry. The kind of wind that strips topsoil and carries it like smoke, swept across the river flats from the southwest. It was not a norther. It was not a blizzard. But it moved fence posts, flattened canvas, and filled the air with grit so thick that a rider could not see his horse's ears. Maddox's men were moving cattle near the river when the gale hit. The herd scattered south. 1 horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and broke its right foreleg at the cannon bone. The rider, Maddox's nephew, a boy of 17 named Willard, was thrown and struck the ground with his left shoulder. A piece of broken fence rail, torn loose by the wind, hit him across the back as he lay in the grass. The nearest shelter was Marit's bank. Maddox arrived at the entry, carrying Willard across the front of his saddle. The boy was conscious but gray with pain. His left arm hung at an angle that arms do not hang at. Blood from a cut on his back had soaked through his shirt and dried in the dust. Maddox dismounted and stood at the entry. He had not been here before. He had mocked this place from the sutler's porch, from the river road, from every conversation where the buried wagon had been mentioned. He had called it a dirt coffin. He had told Eli to remember where his mother was digging. Now he stood at the opening with an injured boy in his arms and nowhere else to go. Marit did not make him ask. She pulled the flap aside and cleared the sleeping shelf. She told Eli to put water on the stove. She took Willard from Maddox's arms and laid him on the shelf, and the boy groaned once, and then was quiet. Maddox ducked inside. He had to crouch. The ceiling was lower than any room he had entered in his adult life. He looked at the clay walls, the sod berm visible through the gaps in the willow lattice, the wagon bows bracing the overhang. He looked at the stove with its angled pipe, the cold shelf beneath the sleeping platform, the drainage trench running clean outside the entry. He looked at the iron bar leaning against the wall by the door. He saw what Quince had seen, what Hester had seen, what Calvin had known from the first day, that this was not a hole. It was a structure built by someone who understood what the earth could do when you listened to it instead of fighting it. Marit cleaned Willard's back wound with boiled water and packed it with a cloth strip. The shoulder was dislocated, not broken. She could feel the bone sitting wrong in the joint. She told Maddox to hold the boy's chest, and she pulled the arm straight, rotated it, and felt the bone slide back into place. Willard screamed. Then he breathed. Then he slept. Maddox sat on the floor with his back against the wall. The gale roared outside. Dust sifted through the entry despite the double flap, coating the interior with a fine brown film. But the air inside was still. The walls held. The bank above them did not shift. "I called it a grave," Maddox said. Marit was washing the blood from her hands in the water bucket. She did not look up. "You were not the first," she said. Maddox left the next morning with Willard riding behind him, the boy's arm bound in a sling made from wagon canvas. He did not thank Marit. He did not apologize. He rode east in the settling dust, and Marit watched him go the way she had watched him go in October, with his men behind him and his back straight and his certainty visible in the set of his shoulders. But the certainty had cracked, not shattered. Men like Maddox did not shatter. They shifted, the way a bank shifts when the water finds a new channel through it. The old shape remained, but the weight had moved. 3 weeks later, at the sutler's porch, a drover from Maddox's crew began mocking a woman who was cutting sod near a creek bank south of the river. The woman was working alone, and the drover said she was building a prairie dog town. Maddox was sitting on the porch. He had not spoken. The drover looked at him for the laugh that usually came. "Let her finish," Maddox said. "Some people know what they are looking at before the rest of us do." The drover stopped laughing. Maddox did not explain. He drank his coffee and looked at the road, and the woman by the creek kept cutting sod in the quiet that Maddox's 6 words had created. It was not conversion. It was not redemption. It was the sound of a man who had been wrong admitting it in the only language he had, by stopping someone else from making the same noise he had made. Orrin Vale came to the river in June. He was 35, a widowed blacksmith and farrier from Wichita who had lost his wife to cholera the previous summer, and his shop to the creditors who followed. He had come west with a portable forge, a box of tools, and a willingness to work for anyone who needed iron-shaped. He heard about the Vangan woman from a cavalry farrier at Fort Dodge, who said she had a stove with a cracked leg and a chimney collar that needed better metal. He arrived on a gray morning and stood outside the shelter looking at it the way Calvin had looked at it. Not with pity, not with mockery, but with the professional interest of a man who understood materials. "The collar is clay and ash," he said, crouching by the pipe exit. "It will crack every season. If you let me take a measurement, I can forge a tin collar with a clay gasket that will expand with the pipe instead of against it." Marit looked at him. He had large hands, steady eyes, and the particular stillness of a person who works with heat and knows that rushing it produces bad iron. "What do you charge?" she asked. "For this?" "Nothing. I want to see how you built the rest of it." She showed him. He walked the interior the way Quince had walked the dead oxen, systematically, touching surfaces, checking joints, measuring with his eye. He tapped the walls the way Calvin had tapped them, and Marit heard the same sound she had been trained to hear. He found the spot where the overhang thinned, the seam Calvin had worried about, and he pressed his thumb into the clay and frowned. "This wants reinforcing," he said. "Not clay, iron. A flat bar set into the bank above this seam and anchored on both sides. It would not hold a collapse, but it would give you warning. The bar would bend before the clay fails, and the bending would make a sound." Marit looked at him for a long time. He had seen the shelter for 10 minutes, and had found the weakness Calvin had identified in 3 weeks, and had proposed a solution neither of them had considered. "Can you make such a bar?" she asked. I can make anything that is iron and the right shape. He forged the collar that afternoon, working at his portable forge on the flat ground above the bank. Eli watched, fascinated by the bellows and the color of heated metal, cherry red for bending, white for welding, dull red for tempering. Orrin let the boy pump the bellows and showed him how to judge temperature by color alone, and Merritt watched from the entry and saw something she had not expected to see again. A man teaching her son with the patient, specific attention that Calvin had given her. The collar fit. The pipe no longer cracked its seal when heated. Orrin forged the reinforcing bar the next day, a flat piece of iron 3 feet long and 2 inches wide, set into a groove he cut in the bank above the thin seam and anchored with iron pins driven into the clay on either side. The bar sat flush against the ceiling. It would not stop a cave-in, but if the clay above it shifted, the bar would flex, and the flex would create a sound, a low metallic groan that Marit could hear from inside the shelter. Orrin stayed. Not because Marit asked him, not because he had nowhere to go. He stayed because the work was not finished. He fabricated door hinges from wagon tire iron, replacing the rawhide flap with a light wooden door that swung inward and sealed against a clay lip. He built a child-safe stove guard, a frame of iron rods that surrounded the stove on 3 sides and prevented Eli from touching the hot surface when he moved in his sleep. He forged stovepipe collars for 2 of the 3 families who had built bank shelters that spring, riding to each site and fitting the collars himself. The courtship happened through iron, through shared meals after a day of forging, through the sound of Orrin's hammer on the portable anvil, steady and rhythmic, while Marit cut sod, and Eli drew maps in the dirt. Through a conversation one evening about how heat moved through metal differently than through clay, and how both materials remembered the temperature they had been given, and how the difference between a blacksmith and a mason was not the material but the speed of the memory. They married in the autumn of 1883, 2 years after Marit had arrived at the river with dead oxen and a broken wagon. The ceremony was at Hester Bell's house. Eli stood beside his mother. Thomas Bell stood beside Orrin. Sergeant Quince, on his last visit before Fort Dodge closed, brought a bottle of something he did not identify and left before the toasting. The marriage was not rescue. Marit had survived 2 winters alone. Orrin had crossed the state with a forge and no prospects. They came together as people who recognized in each other the specific quality that makes partnership possible on a frontier, the willingness to work at a problem until the problem is solved, and the knowledge that the work never ends. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the living begins. Marit and Orrin built a proper soddy in 1884, 100 yards from the original bank shelter. The soddy had 4 walls, a timber ridge pole Orrin traded 2 months of farrier work to obtain, and a sod roof reinforced with willow lattice. The bank shelter remained, used as a root cellar, a storm shelter, and the place where Marit brought every new family who came to the river and asked how to survive their first winter. Eli grew. He was tall by 12, quiet by 14, and by 16 he had walked every bank and bluff within 20 miles of the claim, marking the good clay and the bad clay, the safe overhangs and the dangerous ones, the places where drainage ran naturally, and the places where a trench would need to be cut. He carried a notebook and a pencil and drew cross-sections of riverbanks the way his mother had drawn them in mud with a stick. He became a surveyor's apprentice at 17 and a licensed surveyor at 21, and for the rest of his career, his maps included notations that no other surveyor in Kansas bothered with. The quality of the clay, the depth of the root mat, the direction of the prevailing wind. Marit and Orrin had 2 more children, a daughter born in 85 and a son born in 87. The forge became a permanent structure beside the soddy, and Orrin's reputation as a farrier and ironworker spread along the river until he had more work than one man could manage. He trained an apprentice, then a second. The stovepipe collars he had designed for bank shelters became a standard item, ordered by settlers as far west as the Colorado line. Marit's claim became known as a stop. Not a town, not a trading post, but a place where people who were heading west could learn what they needed to know before they built. She did not charge for the knowledge. She traded instruction for labor, advice for seed, a day of teaching for a day of help, cutting sod for a widow who had arrived too late in the season. Fort Dodge closed in 1882. The soldiers left. The buildings were sold or abandoned. But before the post shut down, the duty sergeant noted in the supply log that stranded travelers on the South River Road should be directed to Mrs. Vale's Bank Place, 12 miles west, for shelter instruction. The note was not an official order. It was a piece of practical knowledge written by a man who had seen what worked. By 1885, 7 families along the Arkansas had built some version of the bermed shelter, adapted to their materials, their banks, their needs. Not all were wagon-based. Some used pole frames, some used handcart walls. One used the hull of a flatboat that had been abandoned on a sandbar. All of them used drainage trenches. All of them angled their entries away from the prevailing wind. All of them packed their collars with clay and ash, and all of them had been inspected by Merritt before anyone slept inside. Hester Bell's family survived the winter of 1882 with half the fuel they had burned the year before. The bermed shelter she built with Merritt's guidance held for 6 years before the bank began to calve, and she moved the structure to a new site that Eli had marked in his notebook. There is a final image. Marit was 53 when she walked to the original shelter for the last time. It was a summer afternoon after a rain, and the grass had grown over the berm so completely that the slope looked like a natural feature of the bank. The wagon box beneath the clay had darkened with age, the wood swelling and contracting with the seasons until it had become part of the earth rather than something placed inside it. Only the doorway showed, a dark rectangle half hidden by grass, and the pipe, rusted now, the collar Orrin had forged still holding, rising from the bank like a stem from a buried root. She ducked inside. The interior smelled of clay and still air. The sleeping shelf was bare. The stove was cold. The willow lattice had dried to the color of bone. On the wall beside the door, the iron bar still leaned where she had placed it after Calvin died, mud-stained, slightly bent where she had used it to pry a frozen stone from the trench during the second winter. She pressed her palm against the clay wall and held it there. The surface was cool and dry. No cracks, no seep, no hollow sound. She tapped the wall with her knuckle, the way Calvin had taught her. Solid. The clay was still holding the roots, and the roots were still holding the clay, and the bank above was still standing the way it had stood when she crawled under it with a tin cup and a memory of her mother's hand on a turf wall in Norway. She stood in the doorway and looked out at the river. The Arkansas was low in summer, brown and slow, and the cottonwoods along the bank threw shadows across the water. Somewhere east, Eli was surveying a new township and marking the banks in his notebook. Somewhere south, Orrin's hammer was ringing on the anvil. Somewhere in the grass above her, the drainage trench she had cut in the dark during the thaw, the night she had first done Calvin's work without Calvin, still ran clean. By the time the fort closed and the river settlements had spread, 9 families had learned the method from Marit directly. Each one passed it forward in the way practical knowledge moves on a frontier, not through books or lectures, but through a neighbor showing a neighbor where to dig and where to stop. The rules traveled as plainly as she had spoken them. Never trust a wet bank. Cut drainage first. Curve the wind over you, not against you. Keep the stove small. Tess smoked before sleeping. Marit lived out her years on the Arkansas River claim. She never called the shelter an invention. She called it listening to wind, to clay, to water, and to what old hands tried to teach before they were gone. When she died, the iron bar still leaned beside the door of the original shelter, mud-stained and slightly bent, and her daughter found it there and did not move it. On the 17th of November, 1881, a blue-black wall of weather crossed the southern plains faster than a horse could run. Canvas tore from wagons. Horses turned their tails into the wind and refused to move. A man sat down against a fence post in a good coat and did not stand again. The temperature dropped more than 50 degrees between noon and midnight, and the wind drove snow sideways across a landscape that offered nothing vertical to stop it. Rulon Maddox had looked at the riverbank where Marit Van Gen was shoveling clay against a broken wagon box and said, "That woman is not building a house, she's burying herself early." Under the bank, the buried wagon held still. The wind went over. The sod berm turned the air the way a stone turns water. The stove burned low on a ration of cottonwood and chips, and the clay walls held what the fire gave and returned it slowly, degree by patient degree. A fevered child slept. A woman who had no team, no cabin, and almost no time pressed her palm against the warm earth and felt nothing move. On the plains, shelter was not a wall against winter. It was a way to make winter pass by.